It's a hot, dusty day in Babylon. The air is thick with the scent of the river mud and the dry heat, as the exiled Israelites go about their routines, carrying the weight of a distant home in their hearts. Among them stands a young priest named Ezekiel, his thoughts as heavy as the sun overhead. He is far from the holy city of Jerusalem, far from the temple where he once dreamed of serving. Now, like so many of his people, he is trapped in a foreign land, surrounded by the unfamiliar language and customs of their Babylonian captors. But on this particular day, something shifts in the air. As Ezekiel stands by the banks of the Kebar River, gazing into the murky waters, a strange sensation tingles along his skin, like static before a storm. He looks up, and his breath catches in his throat. The sky itself seems to tear open, and a whirlwind rushes towards him, spinning with a force that makes the trees bend and the water ripple. Out of this storm, he sees it, a great, fiery cloud, pulsing with flashes of lightning and a glow like molten metal. Ezekiel stumbles backward, his knees giving way as he falls to the ground, shielding his eyes from the blinding light. But curiosity and awe keep him looking, keep his heart pounding in his chest. As the fire recedes, he sees what no human eyes have ever beheld. Creatures unlike anything of this earth. They are beings of glory, each with 4 faces. The face of a man, wise and contemplative. The face of a lion, fierce and commanding. The face of an ox, steady and strong. And the face of an eagle, sharp and unyielding. Their bodies are covered in wings, shimmering with an unearthly glow, and beneath those wings, something like human hands emerge. As they move, the sound of their wings fills the air like a mighty waterfall, or like the roar of an army marching into battle. Ezekiel's heart races as he struggles to comprehend what he's seeing. These creatures are not alone. They are accompanied by wheels, wheels within wheels, like intricate interlocking orbs, sparkling like precious stones. And the wheels, too, move with a strange purpose, as if they are alive, following the movement of the creatures wherever they go. But above them, rising like a throne above all creation, is a sapphire seat, dazzling in its brilliance. And upon this throne is a figure, human in shape but radiant, like metal glowing in a forge, like fire enclosed in a halo of light. The very sight of this being makes Ezekiel feel as if the air has been stolen from his lungs, as if his soul is laid bare before an impossible power. He cannot look, yet he cannot look away. His entire being trembles under the weight of divine glory. And then it happens. A voice like rolling thunder echoes from the heart of the vision, a voice that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It speaks with a power that makes the earth beneath Ezekiel shudder. Son of man, stand on your feet, and I will speak to you. The words themselves seem to lift him, and though his body shakes with fear, he finds himself standing. His legs are weak, but there is a strength holding him up, a strength beyond his own. And the voice continues, each word cutting through the chaos of his thoughts like a blade. I am sending you to the people of Israel, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their ancestors have been in revolt against me to this very day. Ezekiel listens, the enormity of the task pressing down on his shoulders like a heavy mantle. He is to be a prophet, not in the holy city of his ancestors, but here in the heart of exile. He is to speak God's words to a people who have grown stubborn, hardened by years of suffering and disobedience. His heart aches with the weight of it, the fear of rejection, the dread of being ignored or despised. But as the voice speaks, a resolve begins to take root in him, a resolve planted not by human will, but by divine command. Whether they listen or fail to listen, the voice tells him, for they are a rebellious people, they will know that a prophet has been among them. And then, as if to seal his calling, Ezekiel feels the warmth of something entering his mouth, like honey on his tongue, but with the burning taste of prophecy. He understands that the words he will speak are not his own. They are the words of the Almighty, imprinted upon his very soul. He is no longer just a man. He is a mouthpiece of God's judgment and mercy. The vision begins to fade, the fiery chariot withdrawing into the storm, the creatures, the wheels, the throne, everything receding into the sky as the whirlwind calms. but the memory of it sears itself into Ezekiel's mind, leaving a mark that time will never erase. He is left alone by the riverbank, but he knows he will never be the same. The exile, the distant memories of Jerusalem, the ache of his people's suffering, all of it now fits into a grander story, a divine plan. Ezekiel takes a deep breath, the taste of that mysterious scroll still lingering on his lips. He knows that his path will be difficult, that his message will be hard for the people to hear. But he also knows that he has glimpsed the glory of the one true God, the God who speaks from the heart of storms and commands the course of nations. And with that knowledge, he begins his journey as a prophet, a journey that will carry him through visions of judgment, promises of restoration, and the hope that even the dry bones of a lost people can one day rise to new life. Ezekiel's mind remained a whirlwind, just like the storm that had brought him that first, life-altering vision. But as he tried to grasp the magnitude of what he had witnessed, more visions would come, visions even stranger, even more unsettling, and yet filled with purpose. One night, as he sat in the quiet shadows, seeking the meaning behind his calling, the heavens opened once more, pulling him into another realm beyond human understanding. Before him stood creatures that he had seen before. Those 4 living beings with the faces of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle, their bodies covered with wings, their movements fluid and synchronized. Yet this time they were not alone. Above them, the same brilliant throne appeared, but now its radiance seemed to seep into every crevice of the dark sky, like streams of fire cutting through the night. And as Ezekiel watched, caught between terror and awe, he realized that this vision had a deeper meaning, a message for his people, trapped in the depths of despair and rebellion. The creatures, with their faces and forms, represented the fullness of God's creation and his authority over every corner of the earth. The lion, with its unchallenged strength, spoke of power, the ox of steadfast endurance, the eagle of piercing vision and swiftness, and the human face of the intelligence and compassion that tied them all together. The vision shifted, revealing scenes that Ezekiel struggled to comprehend. Wheels spinning, moving alongside the creatures, yet never turning. Inside the wheels were eyes, thousands of them, all-seeing, all-knowing. It was as if these wheels symbolized God's presence that could see every hidden thought, every unspoken sin, and every glimmer of hope in the hearts of his people. Wherever the Spirit willed them to go, they moved with a precision that was both beautiful and terrifying. Yet amidst these visions, one stood out above all. It was like a dream that held Ezekiel suspended between hope and dread. He saw a vast valley stretching out before him, but it was not filled with green fields or flowing rivers. Instead, the ground was littered with bones, dry, brittle, lifeless bones, bleached by years of neglect under the sun. They covered the valley as far as the eye could see, creating a grim and desolate landscape that seemed to reflect the hopeless state of Israel. Ezekiel's heart sank as he took in the scene, feeling the weight of the silence that filled the air. And then, just as before, the voice of God reached him, resonating through the valley like a whisper carried on the wind. "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel paused, his mind reeling at the question. It seemed impossible. How could anything emerge from such utter desolation? Yet he dared not presume what God could do. With a voice barely above a breath, he replied, "O Lord God, you know." And then came the command, "Prophesy over these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord." The words flowed from Ezekiel's lips, and as he spoke, something miraculous began to happen. A sound like the rattling of thunder filled the air as the bones began to move, trembling and clattering across the ground. Before his eyes, they reassembled, skulls finding spines, ribs clicking into place, limbs stretching out over the dry earth. Flesh began to knit over them, and skin covered their bodies until they resembled a vast army lying still, waiting for the breath of life. Yet, they remained lifeless, silent, and unmoving. The vision was not complete. Once more, the voice urged him, "Prophesy to the breath, Son of Man, and say to the breath, Come from the 4 winds, O breath, and breathe on these slain, that they may live." So he did. And as the words left his mouth, the wind stirred from every direction, rushing through the valley. It swirled over the bones, filling their lungs, stirring their chests with the breath of life. Slowly, they began to rise. First one, then another, until the whole valley was filled with living, breathing beings. It was a sight unlike any other. An entire nation brought back from the brink of nothingness, restored by the very breath of God. The meaning of the vision was clear. God spoke to Ezekiel with words that resonated deep within his soul. These bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, "Our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost. But I will open your graves and bring you back to the land of Israel. I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live." Ezekiel knew that this was more than just a promise of physical return. It was a pledge of spiritual renewal, a restoration of hope for a people who had forgotten what hope felt like. It was a vision of revival that went beyond mere survival. It was a declaration that no matter how lost, how broken, how scattered the people of Israel might be, God's power could reach them, even in the depths of their despair, and bring them back to life. And so, as the vision faded and the valley of bones vanished from his sight, Ezekiel was left standing once more in the dusty landscape of Babylon. But now, he carried within him a message of hope, a promise that he could hold on to and share with the exiles. For in those visions, he had seen both the justice and mercy of God, the power to destroy but also the power to resurrect. And that knowledge would drive him forward, even through the darkest days of his prophetic journey. Ezekiel held onto the memory of that valley, the sight of dry bones coming to life etched into his soul. Yet his visions did not end there. Not long after, another one came to him, just as vivid, just as shattering. This time, it was a vision that spoke of the end and the beginning, of a city that had turned its back on its creator and the promise of a new heart that would emerge from the ruins. In the vision, Ezekiel found himself standing before the city of Jerusalem, not the glorious city of his memories, but a version twisted and darkened by the weight of its sins. He saw the temple, once a beacon of God's presence, now overshadowed by the idols that had taken root in its courtyards. His heart ached as he watched the priests, who should have been serving the Almighty, now bowing to false gods, their faces turned away from the Holy of Holies. And in the depths of this vision, he saw something more terrifying than any earthly judgment. The glory of the Lord, the very presence that had filled the temple with light and power, was leaving. It rose above the threshold, moving away slowly, as if in sorrow, as if the sins of the people had driven it out. The angels with their burning coals followed, and the city beneath them began to change. Fires broke out across the rooftops and in the streets, consuming everything they touched. Ezekiel knew that he was witnessing a vision of the coming destruction, the judgment that would fall on Jerusalem for its infidelity, for the hearts that had turned to stone. But even as the flames raged, and the sight of the abandoned temple filled him with a deep sense of loss, a new image began to emerge, one that brought with it a flicker of hope. In this vision, Ezekiel saw the people of Israel scattered among the nations, living as exiles and strangers in foreign lands. Their hearts were broken, their spirits crushed under the weight of years spent far from home. Yet, amid their pain, God's voice came again, carrying a promise that felt like cool water to a parched throat. "I will gather you from the nations and bring you back to your land. I will sprinkle clean water on you and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and idols." Ezekiel saw these words washing over the people, cleansing them of the darkness that had taken root in their hearts. But it did not stop there. As the vision unfolded, he saw God reaching down, taking away the hearts of stone that had hardened inside his people. He replaced them with hearts of flesh, hearts that could beat with love, with repentance, with a longing for righteousness. Hearts that could feel again, that could recognize the voice of their Creator. And in this new heart, God planted his Spirit. Ezekiel could see it like a breath of wind that stirred inside each person, filling them with life, with strength, with the will to walk in God's ways. It was a promise that God would not abandon his people, even in their darkest hour. He would renew them, rebuild them from the inside out, creating a people who would know him truly and serve him with devotion. For Ezekiel, this vision was as profound as the sight of the valley of dry bones. It was a promise that even when all seemed lost, even when the temple lay in ruins and the people were scattered like dust in the wind, God's plan was not finished. Destruction was not the end. Restoration was coming. A new beginning was waiting, one that would be rooted in the deep, unshakable promise of God's love and the renewal of his covenant. As the vision faded, leaving Ezekiel standing once more among his fellow exiles, he held this promise close. He knew that the road ahead would be hard, that Jerusalem's fall would break the hearts of many, but he also knew that within the ashes of their pain, God had planted a seed of hope, a seed that would grow into a future where their hearts would beat again with life and where the glory of the Lord would once more dwell among them. And so, with the weight of both judgment and promise heavy upon him, Ezekiel prepared to speak this vision to his people, knowing that each word carried the power to tear down and to build up, to break and to heal. Ezekiel returned to his people, burdened by the weight of the visions he had seen. He walked among the exiles in Babylon, sharing the promises of hope and restoration, but also the harsh truth of the judgment that had fallen upon them. Yet his mission was far from complete. God had another charge for him, one that pressed heavily on his spirit. One evening, as Ezekiel sat alone, lost in thought by the river's edge, the voice of God came to him once more, clear and unyielding. "Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the people of Israel. So hear the word I speak and give them warning from me." Ezekiel's heart tightened. A watchman, one who stands on the city walls, eyes fixed on the horizon, alert to any danger approaching. This was no easy role. It was not simply about speaking comforting words. It was about sounding the alarm, even when the people didn't want to hear it. He had to warn them, to shout out to those who walked in darkness and guide them back to the path of life. God's words echoed in his mind, each one carving out the gravity of his responsibility. "When I say to a wicked person, 'You will surely die,' and you do not warn them or speak out to dissuade them from their evil ways, they will die for their sin, and I will hold you accountable for their blood." The words were like a sharp blade, cutting deep into Ezekiel's soul. If he remained silent, if he hesitated to deliver God's warnings, the burden of those lost would fall on him. He would bear the weight of their unheeded sins. But if he spoke out, if he raised his voice like a trumpet and they chose to ignore it, then the responsibility would shift to them. They would bear the consequences, but Ezekiel would be free of their blood. It was a lonely task, this role of a sentry. He would have to stand firm, even when the people turned their backs, even when they mocked him for his words. He would have to warn the stubborn and the proud, those who insisted that their ways were right even as they walked further from God's light. And he knew deep down that many would reject his warnings. Yet, there was no room for silence, only for obedience. Ezekiel tried to imagine what it would be like, standing before the faces of his fellow exiles, telling them the truths that they did not want to hear. He thought of the eyes that would narrow in disbelief, the angry murmurs that would ripple through the crowd. But then he thought of those who might listen, the few who might hear the urgency in his voice, who might turn back from the edge before it was too late. Perhaps, through his words, some would find the courage to change, to repent, and to cling once more to the hope that God offered them. And so, Ezekiel embraced his role as a watchman, knowing that it meant living between two worlds, the world of human rejection and the world of divine command. He stood on that threshold, peering into the darkness, ready to shout his warnings into the night. He knew he could not control how people would respond, but he could not shrink from his duty. He would be a voice in the wilderness, even when no one wanted to hear it. For each time he raised his voice to warn the people, each time he called out their sins and urged them to turn back to God, he felt the weight lift just a little. And he knew that this was the heart of his mission, not to guarantee results, but to remain faithful to the calling, to be a bridge between heaven and earth, carrying God's messages with every breath, even when those messages cut like a double-edged sword. And as he continued his prophetic journey, he held on to the knowledge that, even in the darkest moments, God's mercy lingered, ready to restore anyone who heeded the warnings. There was still hope, always hope, for those willing to turn back from the path of destruction. Ezekiel would be their sentinel, their voice in the night, watching, waiting, and calling them home. Ezekiel carried his burden as a watchman, speaking words of warning and hope to the exiles. But the weight of his mission often made him wonder about the nature of divine justice. As he wrestled with his thoughts, the voice of God came to him again, this time revealing a truth about the heart of judgment, the essence of divine fairness. The vision came in the quiet of the evening, when the dusty winds of Babylon stilled, and the exiles gathered around their fires, speaking in hushed voices about what they had lost. God's words reached Ezekiel, cutting through the evening air. The righteousness of the righteous will be credited to them, and the wickedness of the wicked will be charged against them. Ezekiel felt a jolt run through him, the clarity of the message both simple and profound. God's justice was not like the whims of earthly kings, who punished or rewarded based on politics and power. No, each person stood before God as they were, responsible for their own choices, their own actions. It was not the righteousness of their ancestors or the sins of their fathers that would determine their fate. It was their own hearts, their own deeds. But there was more, something that burned brighter than the firelight that flickered in the darkness. God spoke again, his voice resonating with a note of urgency. I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live. Turn from your evil ways. These words pierced Ezekiel deeply. He saw the heart of God laid bare, a heart that did not delight in judgment but longed for repentance. God was not waiting with eager anticipation for the sinner's downfall. He was holding out his hand, even at the edge of judgment, hoping that they would grasp it and turn back. Ezekiel understood then that his role as a watchman was not just about declaring the consequences of sin but about offering a way out, a chance for redemption, even at the final hour. Ezekiel knew he had to convey this truth to the people, to those who believed they were trapped by the past, that their fate was already sealed. He stood among the exiles and raised his voice, feeling the weight of divine urgency in each word. The soul who sins is the one who will die. If a wicked person turns away from all their sins and keeps all my decrees, they will surely live. They will not die. His words rippled through the crowd, carried by the wind. Some listened, hope lighting up their faces as they realized that their past did not have to define their future. Others, bitter and resentful, scoffed at the idea, clinging to their grievances against God, refusing to believe that mercy could be offered to them. Ezekiel saw both reactions, but he pressed on, speaking of the justice and mercy that flowed together from the heart of God. He spoke of a God who would hold each person accountable but who also leaned down to the repentant, offering them a chance to start anew. A God who waited with open arms for the one who would turn back, leaving behind a life of rebellion to embrace a life renewed. It was a message that demanded change, but it also offered hope, a lifeline to those sinking in despair. Yet, there was also a warning woven through this message of mercy. Ezekiel reminded them that the opposite was true as well. If a righteous person turns from their righteousness and does evil, none of the righteous things they have done will be remembered. It was a stark reminder that complacency could lead to ruin, that righteousness was not a shield to hide behind, while one's heart wandered away from God. This balance of justice and free will, of consequences and compassion, defined Ezekiel's every message. He understood that God's justice was like a river, steady, unwavering, flowing toward what was right, yet always seeking to embrace those who would reach out for mercy. It meant that the future of each person, each soul, was in their own hands. And so, Ezekiel stood among the exiles, feeling the tension between judgment and hope that ran through his every word. He knew that many would struggle to accept such a truth, to believe that their choices still mattered, even in the midst of exile, even with the memories of Jerusalem's ruins fresh in their minds. But he also knew that this message was a gift that could change the course of their lives if they were willing to receive it. As the night deepened and the fires burned low, Ezekiel turned his gaze to the stars, thinking of the God whose justice reached from the heavens to the earth, whose desire for mercy was as vast as the sky. He understood that his task was not to force the people to choose, but to make sure they knew that a choice remained. To make sure they knew that even in the darkness, A path to life still lay open before them. Ezekiel's message of divine justice and the call to repentance had echoed through the camp of exiles. But there was still more to reveal. More promises that lay beyond the ashes of Jerusalem's fall. God, in his wisdom, had spoken of a transformation that went deeper than outward change. And so, as the days passed, a new vision began to unfold before Ezekiel's eyes. A vision of renewal that was as radical as it was hopeful. The image came to him suddenly, in the quiet hours of the night, when the stars seemed to shimmer with a cold, distant light. Ezekiel found himself transported back to the ruins of Jerusalem. The city lay broken, a place of shadows and silence. Its walls crumbled, its streets empty. But in the midst of this desolation, he saw something extraordinary. God's hand reaching down, touching the very core of his people. It was a vision of hearts that had grown cold, turned into unyielding stone over years of rebellion and neglect. Ezekiel could see them clearly, like fragments scattered across the ruined city, lifeless and unfeeling. They were hearts that had once pulsed with faith, with devotion, but had become rigid, unable to respond to the call of their Creator. Yet, as he watched, the vision shifted, and God's voice spoke, rich with a promise that seemed to hang in the air like the scent of rain before a storm. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. I will remove your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. Ezekiel watched in awe as the transformation began. God's hand moved among the people, reaching into their chests, pulling out the cold, unresponsive hearts that had kept them from hearing his voice. He replaced them with hearts of flesh, warm, alive, beating with a rhythm that matched the pulse of creation itself. These new hearts were supple, open to feeling, capable of love, sorrow, and joy. They could break with grief but also swell with hope, something the hardened hearts could never do. And then, God's Spirit poured out like a river, filling each heart, each person, with a presence that was as gentle as a breeze and as powerful as a mighty wind. Ezekiel could see it flow into them, making their eyes shine with new understanding, their steps light with a purpose they had not known for years. It was as if the very breath that had brought the dry bones to life was now breathing through each of these renewed souls, awakening them to a new beginning. Ezekiel understood the depth of what this meant. God was not merely offering a return to the physical land of Israel. He was offering a return to his very heart, a restoration that would heal not just the land but the spirit of the people. It was a promise that went beyond walls and temples, reaching into the core of what it meant to belong to God. It meant becoming a people who would carry his spirit wherever they went, whose actions would flow from a place of true understanding, whose lives would be marked by the softness of compassion rather than the harshness of rebellion. But this vision also brought with it a challenge for the exiles to believe in a future that they could not yet see, to trust that God's promise of new hearts and new spirits would come even when the present seemed hopeless. Ezekiel knew that this transformation would require them to let go of their bitterness, their resentment over the years spent in exile, and to open themselves to the possibility of something greater. It would mean surrendering the illusion of control and embracing the mystery of God's plan, even when that plan seemed impossible to grasp. Ezekiel could already hear the questions forming in the minds of those who listened to him. How can our hearts change when all we've known is suffering? How can we believe in a new spirit when our spirits have been crushed by loss? But he also knew the answer, one that pulsed through his own renewed heart, one that had carried him through every vision, every revelation. It was the knowledge that God's promises were not bound by the limits of human understanding, that the same God who had spoken to him through visions of glory and judgment, through images of bones and fire, was the God who held the power to reshape the very essence of their being. And so, he spoke to the exiles with a voice that trembled with conviction, sharing the vision of new hearts, of a spirit that would dwell within them, guiding them, shaping them into a people who could live in true harmony with God. He told them of the promise that awaited them, a promise that was as much about the inner renewal as it was about the return to their homeland. Some listened with hope in their eyes, daring to imagine what a heart of flesh might feel like, daring to believe that God's Spirit could transform their pain into something new. Others remained skeptical, clinging to their grief, their hearts still wrapped in the cold comfort of stone. Yet Ezekiel continued, knowing that his task was to plant the seeds, trusting that God's promise would take root in time. As the vision faded and he returned to the reality of their exile, Ezekiel felt a deep sense of peace settle within him. He knew that the road to this new heart would not be easy, that the journey of transformation was filled with trials, with moments of doubt and struggle. But he also knew that the promise was true, and that the God who had spoken it was faithful beyond measure. And so, in the dark nights and the uncertain days, Ezekiel held onto this vision of new hearts, sharing it with those who would listen, carrying it like a lantern through the shadows of exile. For he knew that even in the hardest of hearts, a new spirit could awaken, and that from the rubble of the past, God could shape a future that would beat with life once more. Ezekiel carried the vision of new hearts close to his own, speaking of it whenever he could. But he also knew that the message wasn't just about what was to come. It was about what was happening now in the present, about the urgent warnings that still needed to be sounded. For alongside the promise of renewal, there were heavy words of judgment that pressed on his soul. He knew that his role as a prophet demanded him to hold the tension between these two realities, the severity of God's judgment and the hope of his mercy. The visions continued, and each time the urgency grew. One day, Ezekiel was drawn into a vision of Jerusalem's abominations, its secret sins, hidden behind walls, away from the eyes of men but not from God. He saw the elders of Israel offering incense to idols in darkened rooms, turning their backs to the temple, as if trying to hide their actions from the very God who dwelled among them. He saw the land stained with blood, the people worshipping the sun and bowing before false gods, even as they carried the name of the Lord on their lips. God's voice echoed through this vision, filled with a grief that was deeper than Ezekiel could fathom. Do you see, Son of Man, what they are doing? Is it a small thing for the people of Judah to commit the detestable practices they are doing here? They have filled the land with violence and provoked my anger further. Ezekiel's heart twisted with sorrow, for he knew what must come next. God's justice could not be withheld forever. The time had come for the judgment to fall. But even as these visions revealed the depths of the people's sins, God still spoke of a way out, a path back to him. And in these messages, Ezekiel found the hope he needed to keep speaking, to keep calling out to the exiles, urging them to turn away from their idols, from their violence, from their rebellion. He stood before the people, his voice carrying across the gathering of exiles, his words urgent and unyielding. Turn back from your evil ways. Why will you die, O house of Israel? His eyes searched their faces, seeing the fear, the anger, the stubbornness, but also the flickers of doubt and the seeds of repentance. He knew that some would hear him, that some would recognize the truth in his voice, that God's judgment was not meant to crush them but to bring them to their knees, to a place where they could finally find their way back to him. Yet the warnings came with a cost. As he delivered God's words, Ezekiel felt the weight of loneliness pressing down on him. Many turned away from him, calling him mad, a doomsayer, a prophet of despair. They wanted to believe that their exile was just a temporary setback, that they would soon return to Jerusalem as it was. They refused to accept that the city's ruin had been a consequence of their own choices, their own turning away from God. But Ezekiel persisted, his words burning like fire in his mouth. He spoke of the coming invasion, of the destruction that would sweep across Jerusalem like a flood. He told them that the temple, their symbol of divine protection, would be torn down brick by brick, that the glory of God had already departed from its place. And he spoke of the bitterness of exile not as a punishment without end, but as a necessary breaking, a breaking that would lead to a new beginning if they would only open their eyes to it. And even in the midst of these warnings, he could not help but share the visions of hope that God had given him. He told them of the valley of dry bones that had come to life, of the promise that God would bring them back to their land, of the new hearts and new spirits that could transform their lives. It was a message woven from threads of darkness and light, of the night of judgment and the dawn of mercy. Ezekiel's voice carried on, unbroken by the mockery, undeterred by the rejection. He understood that his role was not to force them to change, but to ensure that they heard the truth, to give them the chance to choose the path of life or death. He knew that God's warnings were never the end of the story, that even in his anger, God's love burned for his people, desiring their return, their repentance. And so, he kept speaking, his words like the wind, sometimes harsh, sometimes gentle, but always carrying the essence of the divine heart. He warned them of the path they were on, of the darkness that loomed ahead if they did not turn back. But he also held out his hands to them, offering the light that he had seen, the vision of a future where they would walk with God again, where their exile would end and their hearts would beat with new life. He spoke until his voice grew hoarse, until the sun set and rose again over the exiles' camp, until the first signs of change began to stir among them. He knew that not all would heed the warnings, that some would hold fast to their rebellion until the end. But he also knew that for those who did listen, for those who let the words cut through their pride, the promise of God was waiting, like a new dawn breaking through the darkness of their exile. Ezekiel's voice carried on through the days of exile, through the warnings and the hopes, weaving a path that stretched between the grim reality of the present and the promises of a future restoration. But even as he spoke of judgment, there came a time when God showed him something more, a vision that turned from words to reality, a miracle that would prove the power of divine intervention. It began in the aftermath of another dark vision, one that left the exiles shaken as they grappled with the prophecies of destruction and the fall of Jerusalem. Ezekiel had tried to bring comfort, speaking of God's promise to renew their hearts, but the sorrow ran deep, and many had grown weary of waiting for hope to come. Yet God's plans were not finished, and he had a new message to deliver, one that would take shape in a way Ezekiel had never expected. One morning, as the sun's first light spread over the horizon, a whisper stirred within Ezekiel's spirit, calling him to rise. He found himself standing before a landscape that stretched endlessly before him, littered with remnants, broken shields, shattered pottery, and the ruins of past battles. The voice of God spoke again, commanding him to look closer, to see the truth hidden beneath the dust of history. As Ezekiel focused, the scene sharpened, revealing what he had not seen before: an abundance of treasure, glinting gold and silver, buried beneath the debris. He realized that these were the spoils of battles long forgotten, left behind by the armies that had once waged war across this land. God's voice rang out, echoing through the air. "This is the inheritance of my people. What the enemy has taken, I will return to them. What has been lost will be restored, and the wealth of the nations will flow back to them." The promise of abundant wealth and resources seemed to cut through the despair that had settled over the exiles. It was as if God was saying that their losses, material and spiritual, would not remain forever. He would not only return them to their land, but he would return the blessings that had been taken from them, a reward for the endurance of those who remained faithful, even through the darkest times. As Ezekiel shared this vision with his people, he could see their faces change. Some of them, who had grown used to the barrenness of their lives in exile, began to dare to hope again. Others, who had believed that they would live out the rest of their days under foreign rule, looked at Ezekiel with a newfound belief. The promise of treasure was more than just gold. It was a symbol of God's intention to restore what had been taken, to make whole what had been broken. And yet, Ezekiel understood that this promise was not only about material riches. It was a sign of spiritual abundance, of a new beginning where their relationship with God would be more valuable than any earthly wealth. God was preparing them to return not just to the physical land of Israel, but to a life of communion with him, where their faith would be their greatest treasure. He continued to speak of this coming restoration, telling the people that just as the wealth of the nations would flow to them, so too would the blessings of God's presence return to their lives. They would see peace in their land, prosperity among their families, and the joy of worshiping God without fear. The barren fields of their past would give way to harvests that overflowed, a symbol of the fullness of life that God had in store for them. Ezekiel's message carried a sense of urgency, reminding them that this future was not automatic. It required their trust, their willingness to turn back from their old ways, to embrace the new hearts God had promised. He warned them not to cling to their old resentments, not to let their hearts remain cold like stone, for the time of restoration was drawing near, and only those who were prepared to receive it would truly enjoy the abundance that awaited them. The vision of the restored wealth, the promise of a future filled with both spiritual and material blessings, became a beacon for the exiles. It was something they could hold on to, a tangible reminder that God's faithfulness extended beyond their current pain. It whispered to them that every loss, every sorrow, every year spent in a foreign land would be met with a divine recompense, a return that would overflow like a river, filling every empty place in their lives. Ezekiel saw hope stirring in their eyes, saw families beginning to speak of the future again, children playing with laughter that hadn't been heard for years. He knew that his work as a prophet, as a watchman, was bearing fruit, not just in the warnings he had given, but in the seeds of hope he had planted. He could feel the shift, the change in the air, as the exiles began to look to the horizon, wondering when the day of their return would finally come. And in his heart, Ezekiel knew that it was all part of the grand design, the path from judgment to renewal, from desolation to abundance. He understood that God's plan for his people was always to bring them back to a place of flourishing, but that the journey through the valley of shadows had been necessary to bring them to this new dawn. The promise of treasure was a sign that their suffering would not be in vain, that every tear would be met with a joy that surpassed it. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Ezekiel stood among the exiles, watching as they spoke of the future with hope instead of dread. And he whispered a prayer, a quiet thanks to the God who had called him to this mission, who had given him the words to speak life into a weary people. He knew that the journey was not yet over, that trials would still come, but he also knew that the God who had shown him the valley of dry bones, the God who had promised new hearts, was faithful to the end. And so, he held on to the vision of restoration, carrying it with him like a lamp through the gathering night, knowing that soon enough, the dawn would come, and with it, the fullness of God's promise. As Ezekiel stood among the exiles, sharing the vision of restoration and the promise of a future filled with abundance, he felt a stirring deep within his spirit. A new message, urgent and powerful, that needed to be spoken. It came in the form of a prophecy, a message that would cut through the uncertainty and speak directly to their hearts. It was a word from God that carried the strength of a warrior's shout and the tenderness of a father's embrace. And it was delivered through the mouth of a prophet who had come to understand the depths of divine love. Ezekiel felt the presence of the Spirit move within him, drawing him into yet another vision. But this one was different. It carried the rhythm of hope, the assurance of a promise that could not be broken. God spoke to him, giving him words that were meant not just for the moment but for the generations to come, words that would echo far beyond the borders of Babylon, beyond the ruins of Jerusalem. The Spirit led Ezekiel to a place where he could see the scattered people of Israel as a single body, a body that had been broken, wounded, and scattered by the winds of exile. But then, as Ezekiel watched, God's voice called out like a command, "I will bring them back to their own land. I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel. One king will rule over them all, and they will no longer be divided into two kingdoms." The vision shifted, and Ezekiel saw the scattered pieces drawing together, just as the dry bones had once come together in the valley. But this time, it wasn't only a physical return that he witnessed. It was a spiritual reunification. The fractured tribes, long divided into the kingdoms of Judah and Israel, were being gathered into a single nation, a united people. The division, the ancient grudges, the broken alliances, all of it was melting away in the light of this new promise. Ezekiel saw them, whole again, standing on the mountains of their homeland, their hearts turned back to the God who had never abandoned them. And above them, like a banner in the wind, he saw the figure of a shepherd, one who would rule with wisdom and justice, one who would guide them as a true king, unlike the corrupt rulers who had led them into ruin. This shepherd was not just any leader. He was a symbol of God's eternal covenant with his people, a promise that his presence would dwell among them forever. God's voice came again, strong and clear, echoing through the vision. "My servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd." They will follow my laws and be careful to keep my decrees. Ezekiel knew that this was more than a reference to the ancient King David. It was a promise of a future leader, a messianic figure who would embody everything that David represented, someone who would lead with both strength and compassion, someone through whom the covenant would be fulfilled in a way that the people had never experienced before. It was a promise that spoke to the deepest longings of the exiles' hearts, a hope that they could cling to as they waited for their return. And yet, the promise did not stop there. As Ezekiel watched, the vision unfolded further, revealing a new temple rising from the ruins, a place where God's presence would dwell among his people in a way that was both tangible and profound. He saw streams of water flowing out from the temple, spreading across the land, turning deserts into gardens, bringing life wherever they touched. It was a vision of a world restored, a world where God's glory was not confined to stone walls but flowed freely, touching every heart, every home, every life. God's voice carried the final words of the promise, filling Ezekiel with a peace that he had not known in years. I will make a covenant of peace with them. It will be an everlasting covenant. I will establish them and increase their numbers, and I will put my sanctuary among them forever. My dwelling place will be with them. I will be their God, and they will be my people. Ezekiel's heart swelled with the power of these words. He understood that this vision was the culmination of everything he had been called to speak, the promise of a future where the presence of God would never again be distant or hidden. It was the assurance that the trials of exile, the sorrows of the past, would give way to a new relationship between God and his people, one marked by unity, peace, and an intimacy that they had not known before. As he shared this vision with the exiles, he could see the flickers of hope grow stronger in their eyes. For the first time, they began to speak of the future with a sense of anticipation, imagining what it would be like to walk once more through the streets of Jerusalem, to see the temple rise again, to live under the care of a shepherd king who would lead them into a new era. Ezekiel knew that the road would still be long, that there would be more trials, more tests of faith. But he also knew that the promise of God's covenant was as unbreakable as the love that had guided him through every vision. He held onto the image of the flowing waters, the shepherd standing over the people, the unity that pulsed through the nation like a heartbeat. It was the vision that sustained him in the darkest nights, that gave him the strength to keep speaking, to keep calling his people toward the hope that awaited them. And he prayed that, in time, they would see that the God who had spoken through him was a God who never left his promises unfulfilled, a God who would turn the wilderness into a garden and transform the exile into a homecoming. And as the exiles gathered around him, listening to the words that flowed from his heart, Ezekiel could feel the shift in the air, a sense that the future was no longer a distant dream but something that was beginning to take shape, piece by piece, promise by promise. He knew that God's hand was at work, drawing them back to the land, back to each other, and back to him. And so, with each word, he planted seeds of a future where Israel would rise again, not just as a nation but as a people who knew their God, who walked in his ways, who carried the mark of his covenant in every beat of their new, living hearts. As Ezekiel continued to speak of unity, restoration, and the everlasting covenant, he felt the depth of God's promise solidify into something even more tangible, something that spoke to the heart of every exile who longed for a place to belong, for a life of peace. The visions of the past had been filled with images of judgment and warning, of scattering and ruin. But now, God's words carried a new theme, one that was both deeply personal and universally transformative. It was a promise that went beyond the physical return to the land. It was a promise of a transformed relationship between God and his people. One night, as Ezekiel sat among the exiles under a sky filled with stars, God's voice came to him again, like a whisper that carried the weight of eternity. He felt the presence of the Spirit drawing him into yet another vision, one that revealed not just the fate of Israel, but the transformation that would sweep through every aspect of their lives. He saw the figure of a prophet, his own likeness, walking through the ruins of Jerusalem, his feet tracing the paths where the streets had once thrived with life. But in the vision, the city was no longer filled with rubble and desolation. Instead, he saw a new temple rising, its walls gleaming under the light of dawn, every stone laid with precision and care. This was not the temple of the past, the one that had fallen to invader swords. This was a temple that spoke of something far greater, a divine dwelling place that could never be destroyed. Ezekiel watched as the temple gates opened, and from within its doors flowed a stream of water, clear, pure, shimmering like crystal in the morning sun. The water began as a small trickle, but as it flowed further from the temple, it grew, turning into a river that carved its way through the desert landscape. It rushed over the dry ground, transforming the barren earth into fertile soil, causing flowers to bloom where only thorns had grown. Trees sprang up along its banks, their leaves vibrant with life, their branches heavy with fruit that never failed, even in the heat of summer. And God's voice spoke through the vision, filled with a warmth that seemed to melt the cold of exile. Wherever the river flows, everything will live. Fishermen will stand along the shores. Their nets will be filled with fish of many kinds. The trees on both sides will bear fruit every month, and their leaves will be for healing. Ezekiel's heart leaped at the sight. This was not just a vision of a physical river. It was a symbol of God's life-giving presence, pouring out from the temple to bring healing and restoration to every corner of the land. It was a promise that the desolation of the exile would be undone, that the places of sorrow would become places of abundance. The river was a sign that God's presence would once again dwell among his people, not just in a building but flowing through their lives, turning even the driest places into gardens. As he watched, he saw the river reach the Dead Sea, that lifeless body of water that had symbolized the deepest points of Israel's despair. But when the river's waters touched it, the sea transformed, its salty depths becoming fresh, teeming with life. Fish swarmed through the waters, and the once empty shores came alive with activity. Ezekiel could almost hear the laughter of children, the songs of those who had found new hope. He knew then that this vision was the culmination of everything he had seen and heard, God's final declaration that the exile would not be the end of their story. It was a promise that went beyond physical restoration, beyond even the return to the land. It was a promise of a world where God's presence would flow freely among his people, where his spirit would bring healing to every wound, where even the deepest sorrows would be touched by the river of life. When Ezekiel shared this vision with the exiles, he spoke with a passion that burned through the weariness of the years. He described the river that could transform deserts into gardens, that could bring life to the dead places within their hearts. He spoke of a God who would make his dwelling among them, not as a distant deity but as a presence that was as close as the air they breathed, as refreshing as the river that flowed through their dreams. He told them of the trees whose leaves were for healing, a sign that their suffering would not last forever, that the pains of exile would be healed by the touch of God's hand. He spoke of a time when their nets would be filled with the abundance that only God could provide, when their homes would no longer echo with the silence of loss but with the songs of a people restored. Some among the exiles wept as they listened, their tears mixing with the dust of the Babylonian earth. Others whispered to each other, clinging to the hope that had been rekindled by Ezekiel's words. They began to dream of the day when they would walk along those riverbanks, when they would see the temple rise from the ashes, when they would cast their nets into waters teeming with life. Ezekiel knew that this vision would not be fulfilled in a moment. The path back to the land, back to the fullness of God's presence, would still be long and filled with challenges. But he also knew that the promise of the river was a promise that God's life would never cease to flow, that his presence would bring renewal to every part of their lives. And so, with each telling of the vision, he planted hope like seeds along the riverbanks, waiting for the day when the water would rise, when the desert would bloom, and when God's glory would dwell among his people forever. He carried the image of the river within him, a reminder that no matter how dry the land might seem, no matter how distant the hope, God's promise was as sure as the rising of the sun, as constant as the flow of the waters. And as the exiles began to turn their faces back toward the promise of home, Ezekiel stood among them, watching the first glimmers of dawn break across the horizon, knowing that the river's waters were already beginning to stir beneath the surface, ready to bring life where there had been only death.